I believe so much that a composition should be honest. It's not moralistic. It's about means for gains. I think that if the means are more important than the content of the message, then no matter what technique of the means you use as a composer, beyond mesmerizing few, won't touch most. Depends what you search in a music piece, of course. Is it a piece of humanity, philosophy, emotion, narrative storytelling? Or perhaps a narrative storytelling carrying all of these, that touches your heart without any chronology knowledge, which I think is the main problem when you study music. You have to organize it in order, and you realize that not all the composers composed with their time period in terms of the fashion of their day. And some were old-fashioned already, some were ahead, at least to our eyes, seen from above the chronology and not from inside their time zone, obviously. But you know what is fantastic is to bring the amazing feeling that, let's say, when a composer dies, inevitably, and that's what I think happened to a composer like Jean Francais, whom I dearly knew well. And I remember calling his widow and telling her after he died, besides my sympathy and my sadness for being orphaned because he was such a marvelous human being, that as a composer for his own music, legacy, it just came out totally spontaneously out of my mouth. I didn't think of it. I said, I think now Jean is finally timeless, away from the chronology of events. In the sense, his music, like all music of composers written and left for us to indulge, to share, to serve, to teach, to present, to perform, to analyze, to record, to criticize, to organize, to perhaps rewrite, perhaps even in the sense of transcribe. Of course, interpretation is a form of recomposition for some, depending what is the amount of the hinted in between the lines that you want to bring out, between the breathing, beyond the structure of the pulse, of the phrasing structure, the agogic, the syntax of music. But okay, let's say you learn the language of a given composer in order to express his or her music. But naturally, it's better to read Russian literature in Russian and to read French literature in French, because the nuances and the music of the language itself, beyond the meaning, the choices of the words and the innuendos and all these subconscious elements which you might not get close to when you try to read it from a transcription. I was going to say translation. Touché. It's a fascinating fact that probably, as they call music as a universal language, I think it's because it touches compellingly the psyche of people, because they identify with the emotions vehicled through the piece. And I think that if a composer, like classical composer as we call them, or romantic era or baroque era or romantic era into classical, and then the other opposite direction into modern era, and then contemporary, which technically should be at the same time. Therefore, anything is contemporary presently, me with you. But in fact, we daydream, travel in the past, which is the present, while we serve the music of the composed and already finished works. And they're encoded in scores that seem so sometimes you hear the piece before you've read the score if you hadn't a chance, and you look at the score as a musician and you go, is that how it's notated? Why is it not seemingly so flamboyant or driven or overlapping the bars and so having this incredibly inspirational run-on sentences. It looks all organized like sliced salami with bar lines, but when you hear it, it seems like the Greeks called the sol psyche, from the air, the breath. It seems like a breath that takes you to dimensions of spiritual and perhaps carnal, emotional otherwares. I mean, it is an escapement from our dailiness, perhaps necessarily so, while transposing their dailiness, and therefore the universality of the language, I think, is also universality of time. I absolutely remember Mademoiselle Boulanger being criticized for having recorded choral works in a non-chronological order, rather in tonality or stylistic kinship that she considered there is between the pieces. So it's a bouquet recital. A recital is like a bouquet of flowers, where she chose compatible music pieces, but they were connected by the moods they create, or they complete, even if they're jumping centuries. And of course, in a more rigorous university research style presentation, where after all, the scholarship is based a lot on the knowledge of the timing of things, the chronology of the events, and therefore the definition of the stylistic areas, which are in fact apparently for perhaps didactical purposes, with strong walls. But in fact, you have these composers like a Schubert. Is he romantic or still classical after living more than a year more than Beethoven, but of course much younger? And his music, does it sound to us in retrospect as a romantic era music? Is Brahms a classic composer, or is he a late romantic, or is he a late classic in romanticism? He's Scriabin, an innovator for tonality into atonality, through bitonality, and perhaps altered tonality, like Ravel, who remains classical, but Debussy, who tries to go through the modes, and not only to express himself in a floating series of chordal progressions which don't have any tonal center. So you have already late Liszt, who tries to get away from the tonal centered tonality through modality, but not organized, more about some kind of trying to get out of the mainstream of the rules. And in a way, Schoenberg defined a new order for the series, where he beautifully expressed emotions through a new order. And in order to taste it, you have to know his language, you have to learn his. So you cannot read a transcription or translation of Schoenberg without to first know what is Schoenberg's 12-tone system about. But you can hear a Schubert song or a Rachmaninoff piece, and it touches you, and you don't really think, perhaps you should, but as a listener, let's say as a lover of music, somebody driving or somebody dreaming or perhaps writing and hearing a piece of music and goes, oh my God, this is so beautiful. It reminds me of something, perhaps scenes of childhood, or perhaps emotional and spiritual situations. Music is evocative for so much. In fact, it is only what it's itself. Mademoiselle Boulanger would say so clearly that it's only what itself says. It's true, it's its own language. But we then decode it through our psyche. Perhaps we belittle it into our world, like if is the sufferance of Christ transposed through Bach's passions reminiscent of our sufferance, and we can have a sense of so we appropriate the elements of the emotion. Anger in the Fifth Symphony by Beethoven, or perhaps vindicative heroism rather than anger. Some kind of a hopeful song of the future, a hymn for humanity, not to fear God and to be brotherhood of humanity in the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. Of course, lyrics there sway that feeling, even if the music itself in D major on the 6/4 chord is poised in a situation of being incredibly emotionally positive compared to the Fifth Symphony, which is tragic, or the Symphony Number 5 by Mahler, which couldn't be more tragic, with this triple note calls in the trumpet and then the orchestra screaming. So you obtain a sense of emotional shock, and perhaps it derails your expectations from a classical music piece, because we narrowly call classical everything that is not pop or rock. Of course, pop, rock, jazz, new jazz. Of course, all these are different genres within the same century of the 20th. And of course, you cannot compare the stylistic differences between Hildegard von Bingen, only saint musician composer, and then you jump centuries and you go to Ravel and you say, oh, that is classical music. Perhaps that will be the case for people who want to just park the classical music elsewhere, like the music for thought processes, for reflection rather than for entertainment and for excitement and for dancing. Of course, you could dance on Baroque music, but the dances are no more used today, so it's more stylized. Even the valse or the waltzes by Strauss and Ravel and Schubert are not danceable per se, and not meant to be, no more than mazurkas by Chopin are but salon pieces for Paris, evoking his native Poland, and the Hungarian rhapsodies of Liszt. So in fact, the power of imagination, reminiscences, and amazing, compelling storytelling opens directly channels to our psyche, and we can enjoy in the same recital somebody play Hungarian Rhapsody by Liszt, a fugue by Bach, which is technically mostly no more emotional, though he introduces a lot of the aspects of humanity in this spiritually elevated and completely, or if not most of it, cerebrally conceived music of organizing voices coming out of a single cell, a bit like cloning. And compared to a sonata form, where you have more classical Haydn establishing the sonata form expression of first and second theme in oppositions, perhaps male, female, and then the search for unity through development of the two opposites. And so the idea that man has some kind of mankind has some kind of power over nature to shape things into terms of sculpture in buildings with symmetry, or garden landscaping, organizing big spaces, structuring for industrial or aesthetic reasons, the land, and for agricultural or for extracting minerals and so on. It seems like we live with our own time, so inevitably they did also live with their own time. And when the composers evoke the music of their church or the music of the pubs in which they danced, of the Baroque times, or the imported dances from South America, like the zarabanda, which Spain Queen made into a stately slow dance saraband because it was too enticing for her population, or then adapting dances to the jig for the men to impress the girls by the jumps. And then of course you can express also tenderness with a minuet, that's very stately. But in fact, all of this is stylized. Is music just a background for life, like a soundtrack of people's lives that accompanies them for their burial or their birth, or their weddings or their birthdays? No. Of course, most of the composers like Haydn, Mozart, and many lived of that because they served daily necessity of music for the rich patrons of theirs. That's, of course, today replaced, unfortunately, for the creativity with recordings. And so, therefore, we reproduce more the music of the past because we can by recording it, and therefore we don't need to hire live musicians for every occasion as they did for those who could afford it in the past. So inevitably, therefore, the creativity of music, the meaning of composition, is it improvisation? Is it just transcription? Is it a requotation of somebody else's piece? Not that copyright mattered, who wrote the God Save the Queen before? Is it Lully for Louis XIV after the operation that he successfully underwent? Or is it Handel, who was passing by the court of Versailles on the way to serve his new king of England, who was the Prince of Hanover, who was anyway his patron from Germany? Or is it Viotti, who wrote 10 years before Rouget de Lille, seemingly the Marseillaise, the French national anthem after the revolution of 1789? You can find this kind of things between Bach and Vivaldi, between Mozart and Beethoven. You could call it musical borrowing. You could call it perhaps theft. But in any case, it could be an homage, or it can be a quotation, sometimes without mentioning, and sometimes really so. When Mozart, as a child, was presented to one of the last living Bach sons, who was in fact one of the London Bach German musicians around Handel, Johann Christian, or Jean Chrétien in French, Bach, who wrote sonatas for the, at the time, transitional keyboard from harpsichord to fortepiano, not yet fully established as the follower of the harpsichord that will overtake the keyboard repertoire through the industry of construction of pianos, etc., dynamic ranges, iron casts, development of industrial capacity to develop, so you have more available instruments for bourgeoisie or for mid-class, and not only for the elite of the nobles who could afford expensive instruments and musicians to go with it, or churches who could hire organists and repair and restore the organs and pay their salaries. Until then, in France in 1905 was separation of church and state, and then all of a sudden the state is in charge of constructing, no, but maintaining the organs in the churches, but really ran out of money to pay salaries for the musicians. Of course, they could use recordings, and lately people with artificial intelligence search to invent computerized systems where you can have a robotized accompaniment when you practice a concerto without orchestra, and it follows you even in your rubato or innuendos or ritenutos. So in a way, all these evolutions of technology, robotizing music or organizing or displaying or multiplying music through recordings or through broadcasting it, and then now, of course, through the web, making it available everywhere in the world that people can connect to it. So it's a fascinating thing that no matter what, and because now you have a more spread capacity to reach more people with a single piece of music, perhaps of a forgotten composer of a famous time period, because history seems to keep a lot of people in the shadow for right or wrong reasons. Who is to define them? Except the curious of at heart, who try to understand better how these famous composers whom we admire existed, as if by spontaneous generation, but in fact they were part of their ecosystem, of their time period, of their context, obviously. And so it's interesting is some fascinating, even more than interesting, sometimes compelling, to research and perform and bring out from being forgotten compositions of composers who, for various reasons, fell in the abyss of human memory of musicianship. I think you can say that it's perhaps just the way it is. People extract the best of everything and they don't want to keep the secondary things. But who defines it in art? It's not exactly a science, nor is it a sport to rank people. Of course, we have favorites for ourselves, and perhaps it evolves in our life when we discover people's music who we thought we don't like, but somehow under somebody performing it or staging it or re-narrating it, or in a way make us love what we thought we didn't love, and or we thought is not for us, or it's not for me, it's I don't like that, it's not for me, it's not my, well, and not everything is for everybody, obviously, but I think there is such a beauty in the fact that all these authors, composers of the past, recent or distant, somehow felt the necessity to notate on, as imperfect as the notation could be, as difficult as it was to survive any infectious disease or any plague that or any fire that could have burned that manuscript besides killing the composer. And so it's the vulnerability of the transmission of music that somehow came to us. I find that like almost miraculous and moving. And what do we have there encoded in these few bars of pages? Perhaps some people will consider some of the music banal, meaningless, repetitive, just feeling the dailiness of the job for composers who had to provide, as I said earlier, of course, daily music for their patrons, and they didn't have time or perhaps inspiration to write something original or pushing further the envelope of their imagination or of their text or of their perhaps, well, of course, the thought process, but mostly the technique of writing. And if the technique of writing becomes more meaningful or more striking than what they have to say through it, I think sometimes it gets lost. Perhaps on the spot it becomes very famous and then perhaps misunderstood. I mean, I imagine Poulenc in 63, or rather in 61, because he died in 63, hearing Boulez's sonata being premiered, the idea of these two people, the music of the one heard by the other, when you know how Poulenc represented really the music of the tradition, not to let, and quoting Mozart even, like in his two piano concerto, is it neoclassical, is it neo-baroque, whatever you want to frame it, to call it, it was Poulenc. And when you hear it, it's so beautiful if you like it. It's so moving and driven and enticing, and you can whistle it in the streets just like a pop song, because you think, oh my God, it just touches me so much. It's me, it's for me, it's, I identify with it. I don't reject it because it's not dodecaphonic or because it's not modern, or at that time already I learned that Stravinsky already wrote the octotonic modern mode, Rite of Spring, which was the revolution of the 20th century. So okay, not every composer writes revolutionary works. And there are some composers who are not meant, or perhaps didn't imagine, or just happen not to be innovators. Does it make them less meaningful to us in the sense of the transmission of what they encoded in the page? I find it, on the contrary, marvelous that once they are dead, we appreciate their music for the value of the essence that it is, rather than compared to others when we see their lives. Oh, they died very young, or they died very old. If they died very young, obviously they couldn't get the influence of the later. And then if they died very old, then they kept on their tradition, and perhaps others had found another path ahead. It doesn't cancel each other. It's not like somebody coming up with a theory that in science will then over it will override the preceding one if it's proven by science, which is a factual event of a series of events. Music, it's not like this. Mozart doesn't cancel Bach, and Schumann doesn't cancel Mozart, and Stravinsky doesn't cancel Brahms, and so on. It adds, it enriches, it has a different flavor to our life. So yes, it's probably in a way music becomes the I call it soundtrack of our lives. And for different moments of our lives, psychological situations where our psyche is driven or down, where we are funeral in our feelings, or in love, or enamored in something, or in person, or we are driven. In other words, we are alive. We live, we respect, but we receive, and we vibrate through our senses and through our spiritual uplifting, through our brain, through our amazement of a structure, construction, but also an intense, I would say storytelling is perhaps a bit reductive, but some kind of narrative component which touches our selves at all levels, and not just specifically for the dance, or for the singing, or for the theatrical operatic way of presenting theater, or a ballet, where the gestures of the body are so emotional to us because they represent, in fact, allegorically the meanings of the words. And so does an interval between a consonant and a dissonance, or a chosen dissonance compared to a consonance. It's also a conversational tool to express the emotional influx in the composer's storytelling. And I find that being knowledgeable about it, studying about it, learning about it could appear necessarily more like a pharmaceutical approach. I'm a pharmacist. I want to know the ingredients of the medicines I sell so that I don't poison my patients. But of course, by essence, a medication, it's a poison, the dosage of which allows you to be cured. And the wrong dosage obviously poisons you to death. And I think that this amount of knowledge makes of musicians musicologists, like pharmacists, pharmacologists, or we become medical doctors when we search for specific niche that we want to study more and be able to understand gynecology, or brain understanding of the function, even if it's still mysterious. But a lot of things are being understood and read through different ways of scanning and reading and defining and organizing. So yes, there is a level of science in music, no question about that. And I think that if people are interested more about numerology and mathematical equations in Bach's fugues, for instance, they're served. I mean, the art of the fugue, especially the musical offering on the Bach's subject chosen by the Prussian king to humiliate him that he couldn't improvise a six-voice fugue in court. Well, thank God for this anecdotic fact. Was it really so, or is it just embellished truth? But nevertheless, because of that, we have the writing of Bach with so many incredible amount of ways of treating the subject called royal subject, canonically, and with augmentation and reverse motion and retrograde, and combine the above, all the above, and write it a trio sonata, and write it in a six-voice fugue, the one that he couldn't improvise on this chromatically complex subject that the amateur flutist king displayed and asked in front of his court for Bach to improvise, and Bach said he couldn't. So the idea of we can get that level also with every composer. The structure of a symphony by Beethoven, or the asymmetrical or symmetrical constructions of the works that we play or hear or conduct or sing in, perhaps just as an amateur chorist, or we practice as an amateur pianist, or we practice as a hopefully professional performer. And then we add this knowledge with editions and comparative editions and source materials. And of course, this is the portion of musicology where we need to know as much as we can find, and sometimes it's not available because inevitably wars and revolutions and simply fires happen and happened, still do, alas. But in the past, a lot of the libraries burned already in Alexandria way when, and all the time we have even composers like Henri Duparc, who threw away in the Seine River all his life's works of composition except 15 songs, which were at the publisher at that time, which now we cherish because they're so beautiful, and we think, what was the rest? So sometimes it's in that case some kind of a self censorship by the composer himself, who says, it's not worth anything. Perhaps they are having low esteem of themselves or overly big humility of themselves, and compared to those who quote other composers or steal or borrow and don't mention it, like Mozart with J.C. Bach in his concerti, as I said earlier, when he met Bach's last son in London, but he doesn't quote him when he wrote his first concerti that is taken from the sonatas by J.C. Bach. Perhaps it was not in the way of doing things back then. You didn't have to quote, there was no copyright. All these things bring me to think that as a teacher, of course, I try to bring to the students closest to what the score tells us, and my studies brought me to know through the knowledge of the stylistic facts and the time period, how you play the ornaments. Do you start on the upper note before in the Baroque era, and when do you define the end of Baroque era? Do you play them on a real note in the classical romantic era? And who of the composers who happens to overlap, as I said earlier, Schubert for me is more a romantic than a classic. But imagine for a second if Beethoven had met Schubert, which allegedly he didn't in the same city, since Schubert was not a official composer, rather some kind of a hippie of the best size kind of the word, and never performed. Beethoven could have been influenced by Schubert, who knows? Or Mozart misunderstood Beethoven totally. Of course, the young Beethoven. Perhaps it was an arrogance. Perhaps it was Haydn who thought Schubert, of course, didn't know him, but Mozart he met. He felt it was like his spiritual son. Mozart even writes his first quartets, or the few first, and he dedicates them to Haydn with a letter saying, "These are our children." To Haydn, so there is affiliation. Beethoven, of course, is inevitably in the style of Haydn when he starts composing for the piano his sonatas in 1800, and then where does he go in 1827, where he dies? In less than 30 years, he's already way overlapping beyond this. But you realize those time periods that for, of course, learning practicality, we have to limit in time periods, don't correspond to the composer's inspiration. Will it be innovators, or perhaps, if we look at the chronology, inevitably they would be old-fashioned. Even Bach was nicknamed the Old Whig, so as to say that fugues were considered austere when ballet was already starting to emerge in the courts as more meaningful entertainment rather than... Well, anyway, it is difficult to summarize so many thoughts that come to mind. As you notice, I jump constantly from one thought to another, and somehow miraculously I go back to a thought that I didn't finish completing. Because so many of the it's an arborescence of thoughts of the composers write music, which of course was mostly, mainly aimed at serving their immediate purpose, a patron's a, commission, an opera house commission, or a patron's commission to a position, or just writing something about the evolution of the instrument, the tuning of the instrument, well-tempered clavier, harpsichord for Bach, into fortepiano, with unisons and octaves in chromatic capacity to play in every key on the same keyboard. That's also a purpose to write didactical music, because Bach was also not only a composer in the sense of just writing for the muses, but also for his students and his children. And so he had a pedagogical input in his inspiration, besides the church for the Lutheran service and the chorales which he organized on the organ, or for the choir to sing the congregation, or even entertainment music which he wrote for the Two Swans Tavern, which became the Leipzig future orchestra's still oldest in the world symphony orchestra, Gewandhaus Hall. So he secular or sacred or instrumental, these different types of motivations, you call it perhaps callings, brought composers to write incredibly beautiful contrapuntal polyphonies in the Renaissance, in the Elizabethan time, and the industrialization progressively bringing more instrumental music, from the lute to the harpsichord to the piano to the organ to the synthesizer to all these evolutions. And of course, while you play today on the modern piano music of the past, in a way it's a betrayal for some, or a translation for others, or is it just compared to the capacity to restore and build instruments that are reproduced like those of the past, then you don't need to play the old music on the modern instrument. You can just search not only to play on the old instrument, the old music, or the music of its time, so the instrument matches the specificity of the time period or area in the world where this instrument was used. I think it creates a whole paradigm that changes. You don't articulate the same way, you don't express the same way than on the piano, because of the dynamics, because of the phrasing, because of the articulations, because of the decorations, which were more or less interchangeable or improvised, notated by Bach for didactical purposes, or by French harpsichordists not, because they taught the good taste, le bon goût, and the students just basically in kinship imitated them. And then in short lifespans, with copying some of the scores from the student, copying from the teacher's book to the student becoming the teacher, and the induced or by mistake, literally mistaken notes were combined. So sometimes we don't know intent or omission, and we try to think, oh, he wouldn't have never done this because I know other works like this of his. But composers are also allowed to surprise us. They're not supposed to only fit our pedagogical way of didactically studying them and confining them to their time periods. And therefore what type of dissonances they'll do and what type of ornamentation they'll do and how their table of ornamentations corresponded for the French school, the Dutch school, the English harpsichord school, and then the fortepiano and the dynamics and the phrasing and the pedaling and the imitation of song and dance according to the instruments, and then the length of sound and the acoustics of the rooms in which they were played for the purpose for which they were played. Chopin almost never gave a recital in a big hall compared to Liszt, but in salons. Then Liszt played concerts in a great number in great halls and inaugurated the interpretation of other people's music, unlike Chopin, who was never asked to play Mozart or Beethoven or any of the predecessors. They always expected he'll play Chopin when he was invited somewhere, and so was Mozart in any court he went. He composed a piece or improvised a piece or played the viola in a quartet for a patron that he composed with friends to play. And it was unnecessary to only study the past because they learned it quickly, perhaps because of the short lifespan or perhaps the quick development of their skill. But inevitably they lived in a given time, of course, but also in a given time space, and in a way geographically not traveling much and having little compared to today resources to study the past. They were relatively driven by developing their present, and the ephemeral perhaps present of their music, would it be improvised annotated, Mozart's cadenzas, for instance, in concerti, or even the Mozart piano parts he conducted from the piano forte, and didn't need to write it down because he improvised it while he had his friends only copy the orchestra parts, so to say, with the fresh ink still on the stand. And it was sort of a not rehearsed, performed or interpretation. It was literally read, performed, and complex, not simple because of that. It was because time was scarce, and they didn't, and the survival was tough, so they didn't have time for many rehearsals or money for it. In comparison to today, when we can afford to study more in depth and spend doctorates and years of research, marvelous! I think it's incredible. So in fact, our musicians who study music, the scholars from this perspective, know so much more about the famous and the less famous and of each time period, and they can make a mapping of time periods with such detail and availability of for us to hear and explore and play eventually, even if not always, as I said, on the appropriate instrument of the time, but we learn about the phrases, the tempi, before the metronome invention in 1820s in Vienna by Melzel, or after, and what is the necessity of explaining, is the tempo a mark of a pace or of a mood, or is it combined, or is it a way to induce an inspiration rather than an obligation about what is the tempo to take for the piece. And of course the audience and the acoustics, as again I say, the instruments also allow to exponentially expand the dynamics or retract them, the action of the instrument for the pianist, how sensitive can they be to play under the escapement, legato by the finger pedal or with the pedal, but without then in this case losing all the resonance, all the dampers are lifted, just like on the harp. But when you only play with finger pedal, you only then hold overlapping the legato, the singing quality, defiant, since the piano by essence is a percussive instrument with a decaying vibration, but during which we give all the life of the sound to connect to the other, and we think, oh, we sing with the piano. We say that we do, we hope we do, we imagine we do. We don't, we deny the decay, so to say, like we deny death of the sound, and we think, oh, it sounds better on the piano, even if it was played for the harpsichord, or composed, of course, and played on the harpsichord. But which harpsichord, in which time period, of which geographic area, with which interpretational or improvisational, notational hints from the unmeasured preludes, we call them so, by Louis Couperin, the uncle of the famous Couperin. There are so many Couperins. Or Bach with his indication, or the composers who gave us their tables of ornamentation. It's a way to give us a clue to their alphabet. It's like what I said earlier about the expression of music through the soul, or through the technique, or through the brain, or combined. And so if you have to study Schoenberg, you cannot hear it simply because you've heard other tonal pieces. So you hear a Bach piece and a Schubert song. They're century apart, but nevertheless, you can comprehend it because they use the tonal system to which we are all accustomed intuitively, even if not knowledgeably as listeners, if not as educated musicians. And then the rapport to time changes a lot. I mean, when you think about it, Bach dies in 1750 and Chopin in 1849. So there is 99 years between the end of Baroque, as we consider it, with Bach's death, and Chopin, who died young, nevertheless, for our standards, perhaps not for theirs then, but still, in terms of our love for his music, it's an amputation of what he would have composed. What of Mendelssohn, Schubert, all these early death composers, Lili Boulanger, would developed, opened, perhaps recreated old music, or perhaps innovated, not always in the same direction. Revolution, revolving. I think it's a fascinating situation because then when we hear a music, we might find it boring if we don't understand it, or if we understand it and we think it's boring, then it's a judgment. We will say, I rather prefer this composer than that for this. Fine, it's true. It's just that if they all are there. And for us as musicians is I think compelling choice to play the pieces everybody considers core repertoire. That means that we can reach the level of performing them, the technical aspect, the difficulty of conceptually understanding what it means. Will I have I can read the notes, I can play the notes, but do I have the wisdom to understand the notes, how they connect? How do I negotiate the formal, of course, thematic materials are striking, but what about the bridges? What about the merging in new sections? And how do I organize and bring and present the structure of the thoughts and the emotions of the composers, even in the lesser important areas of their piece in terms of the thematic material? How do I put it back alive? How do I know I'm doing it right? And perhaps I should not care if I do it right. Ultimately, I should do it as I feel it. And if I do it because I've studied it, then I'm framed by some rules that come from that knowledge. But it shouldn't erase the intuition, the first reason for which you play the music, or you want to learn a language because you want to read perhaps Homer in Greek, or perhaps you want to read a manga in Japanese, and because you want to read a Russian War and Peace in Russian. Well, it's not possible for all of us to want to learn everything in every language, even if we are super curious, because life and time and necessities and survival and the dailiness of things. We can be interested in ancient civilizations, in dead languages, as we call them. Yes, and they give us a lot of reflection to understand today, and the philosophy of how they thought life and death and love and hope, all the basic constants of human nature, how they evolved with their time periods and their industry and their understanding of the world and their fears and their hopes and the social systems and their nutrition and their spirituality. And how music fits in all that. What does it say to us about, does it communicate to us only as a escapement from our time? I think it is in part so, but I think it's more deeper than that. It's not just a storytelling to forget. It's not just entertainment. Well, partly it is, to say the truth. And I believe that when you hear something, or you watch something, or you hear something being told to you through a different form, would it be ballet, mime, theater, film, TV series, or web series, or the formats change, but the is it a novel, or is it a biography, or is it a romanized biography of somebody you read, and then at the end of it all, it's what does it mean to me individually, for each of us, either together in a movie theater, or in a concert hall, or by ourselves with our device, or by ourselves with a score if we can read the music, or the specific book in a specific language if we read all that, or even through the translation, which is really a tribute to translators, the real interpreters. That's the point of the word, who give us the capacity to enter in touch through our own limited education from one country, a language, and understanding, if and so on, to reach other levels of things that are having different values, and we want to understand by curiosity. Perhaps we reject, perhaps we belittle, perhaps we admire, perhaps it becomes a cult, perhaps it becomes an ideology, or perhaps it becomes an imposition. You know, it's like people saying, I like Chopin by Lipati, but so what? It's Chopin by itself. Or I rather play Bach on Henley because I know it's the original text, not always available because, as I said, most was lost, or was copies of students. But we always search for that. Desired for us is to always go to that source, as if we are afraid in a way to miss something through the translation, when I think in fact the interpretation for a musician, a pianist for instance, in this case, I wonder why I say that, but it is a fact, it's a translator. And with the same responsibility of the chosen word or sentence or organization of the order of the words as a translator of a text. So even misunderstandings diplomatically of translations can lead to wars, and they did often, besides the greed and interests and impositions and superiorities and inferiorities and slavery and colonialism. And it's always about mankind thinking they're more than even all the other kinds, and destroying the ecosystem for our own needs, or at least apparently so. In other words, we always get to the point where the futility of a piano piece played by a given performer of an old time period, the culture of the understanding of the text translation in the transmission of the performer, it seems very full of vanity in all that. I mean, it doesn't solve problems with famine in the world, or civil wars, disasters, or the cruelty of human beings. But you think one human being at a time might be a drop in the ocean, literally. It touches our hearts, and perhaps it makes us better people. At least we think that we can have more tolerance in our hearts after listening to some music. It doesn't happen like that, perhaps abruptly and so bluntly as I perhaps naively present it. And I think that I'm not believing that either very much, I must say, probably my own devil's advocate saying it. But there is some kind of little insidious parallel channel to the music you receive, regardless if you understand it in the translation or not, in the knowledge or not of it, and all this and all that. Just the emotion and the meaning of it that you capture, that perhaps wrongly compared to the intent of the composer of or of the knowledgeable musicologists of it. But you say, don't care, this means to me for what I can identify for. It reminds me the death of my child is a tragedy, or it reminds me of the birth of my child and the greatest hope, or something like this, falling in love, sharing, giving, and then thinking for life and for the others, and altruism, and sharing with the others something so special and beautiful. It's not about organization like a religion. It's all about overlapping all these cultural and cult necessities that humans need to explain their finitude and understand the mysteries of the afterlife in which they hope, and so on. So we all facing these existential facts of our lives that bug us differently and at different times. And to say bug us, it's a not very appropriate term, I'm aware of. But I would say that constantly compel us to search more about what it is the meaning of what it is. And I find that sometimes when you go and you sit or you stand or you jog or you whatever activity or contemplativity is, I don't know if the word exists, you do when you listen to music, it's beyond this being the soundtrack of your activity, it is also some kind of a soundtrack of your psyche. Of course, pop music is more meaningful to most people because it's simplified in its musical expression, but at the same time, through lyrics or even without, it connects very deeply to our personal lives. You know, the first dance, the second dance, the last dance, with whom, how I fell in love with this song. It reminds me of my youth. All the time before was better than today. That is the ongoing seasons of life of humanity, and nostalgia, and all these things are vehicled through the music. And I think that in a way it's a nurture. I mean, it's really food for our souls, basically. And if I cannot say that I personally, even if I'm an educated musician, I still prefer to love the music more than understand it. Not that I try to divide the two, but I don't think I love it because I understand it. I think I understand it because I love it. And sometimes I love it and I still can't understand it. And perhaps there is nothing to understand, just to love. Accept it and just be with it. And see what it does to you. Does it make you a better human being or not? Perhaps you're already a good human being. Perhaps you're a bad human being. You'll remain a bad human being. Moralistic aspects in it, I think I shouldn't put in, because I don't believe that is a direct impact on it. But who knows? It possibly happens in some cases. Who is to know? It touches us very deeply. That's why I think and I believe very much that composers leave us a little piece of what was essential to them, as if telling us through the lines, at least how I hear it, I feel it, I comprehend it, I receive it, I filter it, I vibrate to it, this is what life is for me. It's precious. Live it intensely. Hopefully this connects with you too. It's like some kind of message in a bottle in the ocean of time. And then everybody plays it or nobody plays it. Somebody discovers it. Somebody rediscovers it, like Mendelssohn for Bach, as we are told. Some people don't rediscover. I was trying to help Dupont. Not that I have to help him. It's very sounding pompous. I meant I tried to help Dupont's music become as present as Debussy's and Ravel's in people's expectation of this Impressionist time period, symbolism rather. Anyway, it was a calling. It was not a commission or or career movement or some kind of need to use it for my own development. It was really altruistic in that pure sense of the word. And I find that it's very helpful. I mean, true love is altruistic, at least parental one, and of course sometimes the chosen one too. Same way we get to have a kinship when we develop musical repertoires by practicing pieces of different centuries and time periods within the centuries, not to mention within even decades, that can be so different because, as I said, some composers were more retrograde and some more avant-garde for their time period. The audacity of the modernity of the musicians of the past perhaps escapes us today because, in a way, this chronology is mostly important to university level studies. But when you study how to play the piece as a child, as a youngsters, of course they should know about the, what was happening in that time period, who were the painters and the sculptors, like which were the wartime sonatas by Prokofiev and which war was it about and where. Of course, it doesn't mean that you will play it better because you're more informed, but at least you get some kind of a idea rather than just a vague thought. By saying, perhaps it doesn't matter to me if Frescobaldi was not a student of Ravel, because obviously chronologically is impossible. And if I find a kinship between the pieces of the two, then I can present it in a recital and think that this is my choice. Or if I want to teach it, of course, in a pedantic course, I have to teach it with the organization of chronology. I could organize it by style, I could organize it by chronology, I can organize it by chronology, explaining how some were ahead of the chronology and some behind. Mademoiselle Boulanger was telling me often about Schubert, or Lily Boulanger, her sister, that composers find the tools of what they're given to have for the trade. They find in these tools what they need to express what they have to say in music. And naturally, that is not the case for Beethoven, who had to dig, change, break the mold that he received of the style and the way of organizing the notes and the music and the form and all these things. So he is an innovator because he was really unable to be himself completely unless he reorganized the alphabet. Perhaps not as fully as Schoenberg in his own time, but somebody like Poulenc or Satie, enigmatic Satie, old-fashioned and timeless. Perhaps in a way everything is timeless, but some appear modernistic, mostly according to comparison to others. So yes, Poulenc, Boulez, it's obvious. But if you take them individually, you can absolutely admire and love them without to have to put them in a chronological order and say, oh, this one enriched the past and this one harvests the future. And I think this is cliche. And it was overly used even in my life when I played my sonata. I was 18 for Xenakis, and he told me after the fourth bar, stop. And he said, you're losing your lifetime if you are going to continue in music by enriching the 19th century. And I found that true in his point of view, and even today with decades later I can find some meaning to that statement of his point of view. But it's not what I seek in musicianship. So I'm glad he didn't need to, and he sought his own avant-garde compositions. I don't. It doesn't mean that I fight. I have an arrogance to consider that I will continue even if my elders tell me that because they're already more experienced. No, it's like no. I think that's why I was saying in the beginning what I believe is if honesty is at the heart of the statement, then the means of saying it analyzed, understood, compared, chronologized, fine. But if there isn't something that is vibrantly meaningful in the melodic line, in the harmonic colorization, in the rhythmic enticement, or the combination of the three, or perhaps only one of the two, I mean, perhaps other elements, other levels of comprehension of the music which we haven't reached yet. Perhaps there are more symbols or more meanings that are hinted. And so we rediscover them by repracticing them. We've never found, even in one's own life, of course, a definitive interpretation of a piece. I've never done full circle anything. I've scratched the surface, perhaps, of the volcano's ring, but I'm still on the surface. And I think all educated people will tell you that the more they dig, the more they realize they only scratched, and therefore the depths of understanding in archaeology, there's still so many things to be discovered in the bottom of the oceans, in the middle of inside of the pyramids. I mean, we can go far and far in these things and say that we are driven in our short lifespan between the known and the unknown, before we are born and after we die. And during this short time, it's like the analogy to the decay of the piano sound. We capture the essence of things, we share them, we understand them or not, we misunderstand them or how, but in the process, we revive them from just the notation on paper or now on tablet. It's like the signs of the language and the pronunciation and the enunciation, and to appreciate the sounds and how you pronounce this vowel in this language compared to this, and on which pitch you place it, like in different languages, which pitch, the vowel, the consonant, the tension, is the way you place the verb, tension, release, the harmony, or the sounds like the notes, and the pronunciation, the ear, the mother tongue. That comes intuitively, and then the others that you learn. So the learned and the inherited, and then the discovered, and then the developed, and then eventually the composed by yourself, and eventually not self, hopefully always censored, and then it can survive, and we can look at it. And even if some people will say, oh, it's not important, the important people in that time period are this, and that, we have no time to study the others. Okay. But I can still take the little road and look through the maze and see what sometimes curiosity is the best. Not curiosity for the sake of it, but it's just like an intuition that you feel like there is something I would like to find more in this. I know everybody has seen everything in this ballade by Chopin, but I'll play it. I want to reach their level because they're my predecessors. The text was there before us, the text will be here after us. The interpretations already documented, unlike alas for the past of the composers we serve from the 19th, 18th century and before. But still, we have now more for a young musician information. How it was played, how it was replayed, how it was replayed. What did Busoni do with Bach, and what did Henley do with Bach? And what does harpsichord articulation do with the piano articulation in Bach? What is playing evenly, expressively on the keyboard of the piano and unevenly on the harpsichord? How do you phrase? How do you imitate a voice, a bowing, a breath, an instrument? Is it orchestral playing on the piano? Is it piano that sounds like an orchestra? Do you prefer the imaginary operas of Chopin that never wrote a full opera or any opera, but so many operas in his pieces, arias and marvelous piano music where he enhanced the instrument almost beyond its capacity of what it's meant to be, a percussive instrument. So the denial and all that. I think that is very important that we keep always very humble and very, very truly humble about the fact that we can and we should value, serve, love, perform, teach, whatever it is that we do with the music, write about, organize it in courses or in whatever form of sharing of what is the specific of this and how it expresses itself and how it enriches me to play something else. Perhaps I'll be inspired by knowing the Frescobaldi toccatas when I play Prokofiev toccata, which has nothing to do, apparently, or perhaps does it, and so on and so forth. And of course, you cannot find you shouldn't try to find something in order to prove your ideology about it, because then it's artificial, as reorganizing the order of the tones, but then it becomes its own truth. So you have to create your own alphabet to create your own music world, but it's a bit more hermetic for others to be able to enter in it. Lucky the few. Like in medieval days, the monks were the only people who wrote and read and copied books before the publishing and Gutenberg. And so the display and spreading of knowledge evolved in time too, and the amount of knowledge of the past for each time period was different, less, more or less, today the most, probably from all times before. Does it inhibit some creativity? Perhaps, more than if people of the past knew. Who's to say that if Mozart was introduced to all the Bach cantatas, he would have said, oh, what's the point for me to write my Requiem? Oh, he can say, but it's written a lot with the musical language and technique of Bach's polyphony of choruses in opening cantatas or passions of his. Is it imitation? Is it inspiration? Is it completion? Is it development? Is it you can say that is neo-Baroque for Mozart, or Stravinsky's neoclassical when he writes music that supposedly people made fun to call it, for that time period of his writing, this style of neoclassicism as Bach with wrong notes. All these are very cheap and not worthy ways of describing stylistic facts. Even if they're fun or perhaps entertaining, but once you get to have the culture through the studies, or perhaps through the self-studies, the curiosity, as I said, to dig into a given style and what it means and what it symbolizes when this ornament is played that way, and details. Well, the devil is in the detail, as they say, but it's true, the details make the whole. Of course, the micro and the macro are difficult for our human brain to comprehend, because so much is going on. Especially the piano is the instrument that can play polyphonically so much more than only itself compared to other instruments. Or organ, obviously, for Bach's time was his polyphonic instrument, but he didn't shy writing polyphony for the harpsichord, even if the organ allowed with the pedals keyboard to have extra voice through the feet, then the piano or the harpsichord, the keyboard could. But it didn't stop him to write fugue for solo violin in his partitas, sonatas. And all this written with such little means of technology. No computers, no photocopy machines, no artificial intelligence. Okay, fine, perhaps they would have written even more fantastic things had they had it. That is another silly thought to have. And perhaps at least the children of Bach would have been more thankful if the photocopy machine was invented, instead of copying the 40 minutes of new music for every week's church music that Bach had to compose, and inevitably have his students and children copy the parts in that race against time for the performance, and every week start from scratch. It makes us think that when there is a wish, there is a will. There is a will, there is a wish. There is a wish, there is a will. It goes both ways. I'm admirative and humbled and marveled, and love every music that I love for what it is, or what it is to me, and try to share it that way with my students and my audiences. Of course, I season it with objective knowledge, because if I only teach play like me, then that would be very selfish. But at some point you have to express your opinion as a performer when the student asks you, what is the tempo, what is the phrasing, what is the dynamic, what should I do? Is the tempo determined by the meter choice before the metronome? Do we think that 2/16 is faster than a 2/8 or 2/4 or a 2/2 meter by the half note, quarter note, 16th note, 8th note? Perhaps or perhaps not. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We don't know how they really play because we don't have. Of course, you have their instruments, but we don't have their performances. Did Clara Schumann change in editions after Schumann's death, died? Some details after she used to perform his pieces to promote him, as she did beautifully for us today to know him. And perhaps to a certain extent, they evolved in her performance than the moment they were composed by him, and they're not frozen in time when they were just composed. They evolve with the performers. And I think that we can still have a fresh point of view of the point of view where we see the piece. And not try to perpetuate because we have experience of the piece our way of thinking. It's supposed to be this way, it's supposed to be played that way, it's supposed to be heard that way, you're supposed to reach this effect, you're supposed to play this fingering and this articulation and this pedaling and this, that, and this, that. This way you just play like me because I know how it's right. Okay, that works perhaps very much better perhaps with some students who are very young and who need a necessary, pedagogically speaking, disciplined frame, which with knowledge and their own curiosity and their sensitivity, they will progressively break. But they would know what is from what is not. So naturally, every individual person enters in the music connection differently. If you have a perfect pitch or a very sensitive ear, you intuitively hear more things than another musician who would be more a visual aspect of the score that comes to mind, the structures. This student would immediately visualize better the structure than the details of the elements that they have to learn afterwards. And then the type of memorization they do is different too. Do I memorize patterns? Do I memorize pitches? Do I memorize rhythms? Do I combine them and how? Or do I memorize harmonic progressions or just a melodic line? Or do I memorize just finger positions on the keyboard? Sometimes all of the above, and sometimes one of the above is not enough. Even if the ear can guide you right and fix mistakes intuitively when you get wrong, you can also be misguided and misguess because you think harmonically this makes sense, and the composer can surprise you by not doing what your intuition calls you to do. That's really the case when you have to complete unfinished works, like it happened to me for being asked to complete and perform and record Glenn Gould's piano sonata, and I had to enter in his thought processes of his early sketched and not completed literally blurbs of notes for the first two movements of his piano sonata, which he never completed. So do I guess, and therefore am I proud to think that I'm guessing right, if I have any way to know? Or do I want to be humble and say, perhaps he would have not at all done that I project he should have done, because I can see this theme going in this way, I can combine it this way with the other theme. So it's like a crossword puzzle, and I can say, oh yeah, I found it. But in fact, sometimes in music there isn't one single way to resolve the crossword puzzle, let less for music that is not completed. But even when you play the written music that is totally published for many years and decades and centuries, and you still re-say it in your words, and people imagine that they say, oh, I used to hear this piece but I never liked it. Now all of a sudden your touch, your phrasing, I don't know if they can name it, but when you play it, I like it. And then they become curious about the piece itself. Hopefully then the passing altruism of the performer reaches its point to create curiosity in the educated listener, or the just music lover who would like to know more about something they loved. As I said, it's easier to study more about what you love rather than love what you've studied. I wish I had the vocabulary to express myself more subtly than my thoughts come to mind, but my English vocabulary, unfortunately, is limited. But I try to convey with you how much I am moved by the timelessness of a composition and not by its chronological placement in the evolution of history of music. I value it individually, eternally, unquantifiably, and not rankably. Thank you.